Hey folks, welcome to the video on Ayn Rand, and we're going to continue the discussion of political philosophy. So let me just remind you of a couple of points, well, really just one point, and that's that we're talking now about different conceptions of good, of what it means to have a good society, how a society should be structured or should not be structured. And we looked at Marx, who's on the end of the spectrum, that says capitalism is an evil and we need a better system that deals with these differences in socioeconomic circumstances that is produced by capitalism. Right? Capitalism leads us to a disparity, Marx argued, where the rich get richer and the poor get poorer, and we need a socialist government to kind of balance that back out so everyone has a chance to thrive. And now we're looking at someone on the other side of the spectrum, more on the libertarian side, Ayn Rand, and she's going to argue that we need minimal government. And she actually goes so far as to say that we need what's called laissez-faire capitalism, or unregulated capitalism. We just let the market forces decide who rises to the top, and the best will rise to the top and the worst will fall. Now, a major difference between somebody like Marx and someone like Rand is that Marx thinks there's a problem, that there's a disparity, that there's this difference in socioeconomic circumstance. Rand does not think it's a problem. Rand, in fact, says this is the way life is. Some people are better than others at certain things and they should be rewarded. So there's sort of a deeper emphasis on personal responsibility and achievement in Rand's philosophy than there is in Marx. There's a big central focus on the individual and the individual's ability to be brilliant within themselves and to kind of shine forth. Not quite as deep as Buddha nature, going back to Buddhism, but more in just terms of finding out what really makes us tick. And we'll talk about that later. But Rand herself is also interesting to study because she was one of Marx's exceptions. She was she was born into Russian communism when she was born in Russia. And I believe until she was 18 or 19 years old, forgive me, I forgot the exact time she moved here, but up until that time she lived in Russia, went to school in Russia, and experienced kind of the beginning of Russian communism. And she hated it. And she developed a love and respect for capitalism, and which eventually brought her to America. Okay, so I'll come back to say a bit more about Rand herself in a minute. But let me just go over the major ideas we're going to cover this week, that we're going to cover in this section. So, as I mentioned before, lots of value theory here, and a little bit of epistemology. So, positive and negative liberties are kind of the two different lenses through which Rand sees the world and through which Marx sees the world. Positive liberty is kind of like the right to get something given to you, whereas a negative liberty is the right to be left alone. It's freedom from interference. And people disagree over to what level we have these rights and which right is more important than the other one. Marx is on the side of positive liberty because he thinks that certain rights should be guaranteed by a government or by a state. That's what socialism means. It means to provide everyone with these rights. But Rand is on the side of negative liberty, and her belief is that the government's role is not to give us stuff, but to protect us from stuff. Right? So the main focus for Rand is that the government's role is to keep us from getting harmed by others when that arises, but not to give us stuff to make us do better. For Rand, the focus on it's our abilities that will make us succeed or not succeed. The government shouldn't be giving us stuff to help us succeed, in Rand's view. And we'll go over in more depth what libertarianism means. There are many people in our country, it's a minority, but a group of people who consider themselves libertarians, some of whom are in the Senate. Even if they're registered under a different party, they often consider themselves libertarians at heart. There's publications like, fairly well-respected publications, like Reason magazine, which is a libertarian thinking magazine. And then finally, we'll look at some of Rand's other views, which ethical egoism and rational self-interest are related. Rand's kind of moral philosophy was that not only should the government limit it's interference with our behavior, but it should allow us to thrive. So when the government doesn't interfere with us, that allows us to thrive without being told you can't do that. You have to have this regulation. You have to fill out this form. So Rand and other libertarians are in favor of minimal interference, so we can kind of pursue our own interests and do what makes us happy. So that's actually one place, by the way, where Rand and Marx agree. They agree that the purpose of life for humans is kind of creation or happiness or pursuing your own goals. They just disagree on how we should get there and how the government should allow us to pursue those goals. So a little bit more on Rand. Like I said, she was Marx's exception. She came over when she was young to America, and she was very brilliant. Right? And this is going to be a theme that runs through her philosophy, is that a lot of people who disagree with libertarianism or disagree with this philosophy say that, hey, this philosophy makes sense for brilliant people, but not for everyone else. And libertarians have defenses of that, and we'll get there, but just wanted to point that out. So she was very brilliant. She comes to the U.S. She gets recognized by a famous film director at the time named Cecil B. DeMille. And she does some writing work. She ends up writing some screenplays and some other publications. She publishes some articles in newspapers and things like that, and magazines. But eventually she has her breakthrough when she writes, I believe it was Atlas Shrugged, that really put her on the map. I mean, she had been known before that. But she writes these two books, and Atlas Shrugged and The Fountainhead, and they really resonate with a lot of people. They become popular sensations, and she becomes much more well-known. And these books emphasize individual achievement, so they're often based on some guy who is fighting against an organization to be creative and individualistic. So that theme of the government restricting our freedoms and restricting our ability to be creative is big in Rand's work. And again, the irony is so interesting to see that Marx thought we needed the government to step in to make us more creative, because he thought our creation was being taken away by a lack of government because of the disparity in wealth. Rand says the opposite. She says we need a government to step away to let us be more creative. It's just such an interesting difference there. The other thing I'd point out about Rand, and this goes along with her philosophy of that we need to be strong individuals, she was a huge, big, staunch atheist. She just would not compromise. She said, you should never give up your values or yourself to anybody, including a being like God, right? Which she would have, I mean, she didn't believe in God, so she would have said, including a non-existent being, right? She would have said, you don't give your individual power up to anyone. You are the source of meaning. You are the source of creation, right? So Rand's philosophy is very empowering for a lot of people because it reminds them of the power within them, of their own powers of creation. And it reminds them not to worry about what other people are thinking or doing or, or what God may think or do. And so right down to the very idea of a higher being, she says we should not be dependent on others. We should not be dependent on organizations like the government. We should not be dependent on God. We should just depend on ourselves. That's what brings us value. That's where strength comes from, in her view. So anyways, that's where Rand is coming from. Now, just to get at this concept I mentioned before of positive and negative liberty, try to consider these two situations here. And let me just kind of give you an overview. So in situation one, you basically have some people sitting around a table. There's a nice chest with water bottles, and one person, Anne, is passing out the bottles. There's enough bottles to go around, but she decides, I'm not going to give it to these two, to Kurt and Joanne. And there's no reason given, right? We don't know why, and we're assuming Kurt and Joanne weren't mean, they didn't do anything bad. They just weren't given the bottles. There was enough, and they didn't get them. Now compare that to the second situation, where you basically have a kid getting picked on. He doesn't feel comfortable fighting back because he's outnumbered, and he's just trying to eat his lunch, and he's being unfairly, one could say, interfered with. Now, both of these situations, there's some level of unfairness. The question is, how would you describe or characterize the different ways? It's not the same type of unfairness, though. There's a difference, right? One type of unfairness is kind of more direct, and one type of unfairness is more of a lack of doing something, right? One type of One type of unfairness comes from a failure to do something. The other type of unfairness comes from an interference with somebody else, with something else. So maybe you want to pause it for a minute to think about that difference, so that you can try to kind of get to the core of that difference. But ultimately, what the difference describes is what I mentioned before: the difference between positive liberty and negative liberty. So in the first scenario, the scenario where the bottles are not passed out to the people, even though there's enough to go around and they didn't do anything that should have restricted them from getting those bottles, the bottles weren't given out. So the fact that there was enough to go around and they didn't receive what was due to them, since everyone else got one, that was an example of restricting positive liberty, right? Of basically saying, you're not getting, everyone else is getting this stuff distributed to them, you're thirsty, but you're not getting it, right? That's a restriction of, that's the way the fairness was restricted. It was the positive liberty that was restricted. But in the second case, in the second example, there wasn't anything that wasn't being given to Felix that was the problem. It's rather, the problem is that he's being interfered with or messed with. So that, in that case, it was Felix's negative liberty that was being infringed upon. Now, there are some people who argue that negative liberty is the most fundamental liberty, that is the most fundamental to all cultures, by the way. Right? I don't care how communal you consider yourself to be, or how outgoing and how much you love people. If someone gets in your space, you're going to feel that, and you're going to want them to be away, right? Either you're going to physically push them, or you're going to say, hey, get out of my space. Right? Nobody likes their immediate personal space invaded. And I mean, unless it's somebody you're dating, that's different. But in terms of just your everyday life, your space being invaded, nobody likes that. And so that's why a lot of philosophers have argued that that is a fundamental right, the right to be left alone and to not have your space interfered with. And people like Rand and other libertarians argue that because that is a fundamental right, that is the only right that the government should have its hands in defending. And we'll talk about how they argue we should defend that right later. So let me just make this clear that, again, situation one, where the bottles aren't being passed out, that's an example of restricting positive liberty. And example two, where Felix is being messed with, that's an example of restricting negative liberty. And both of them are wrong, one could argue, in different ways. Now, Marx's beliefs identify much more with positive liberty, because Marx is saying that people need certain things guaranteed by the government, just like those people should have had the bottles guaranteed by I forgot who I said, by Anne, right? So what sort of features would somebody who's a socialist like Marx argue should be guaranteed by the government? Well, obviously what we already have in our country: fire, police, schooling. I mean, Marx certainly would have said all college should be covered, which people have argued for recently in our country. But Marx would also add healthcare and many other services. The government should, in food, housing, things like that, the government should be providing people with all these things so they don't have to worry about, in Marx's case, earning money to get them later and then going through the whole capitalist treadmill. Rand, on the other hand, her view connects with negative liberty because she thinks the government should only serve very limited purposes. In particular, like most libertarians, she believes the government should serve purposes like defending people's right, the use of force. The government should have a monopoly on the use of force. So in other words, if there's a battle, if people are fighting, the government should be able to come in with a police force and break up that situation. So libertarians still believe that we should have police, national police. Libertarians also believe that we should have a national army, military, but not for war. Right? This is a big difference between libertarians and other Republicans, because Republicans tend to say they want minimal government, but they tend to be in favor of intervention in other countries too. They tend to be in favor of wars, just like many liberals actually are as well. Libertarians say no. Libertarians are completely against intervention in other countries. Rand Paul, a senator who identifies as libertarian, who's technically registered Republican, he identifies as libertarian. He's been one of the few who has argued that we should pull back from the Middle East multiple times. sticking, at least in that case, to his libertarian principles. Rand Paul also has a famous quote that I think I cite in The Reader, where he says, "I want a government so small you can barely see it." So for Rand, she's in favor of negative liberty, and the government should only serve the functions not of giving stuff to people, like Marx believes with positive liberty, but Rand thinks the government should just prevent people from harming you. They should prevent people from getting in your space. And the last function that libertarians believe a government should serve is a justice system. So they're fully aware that there's going to be disputes between people, and they argue that we need a reasonable justice system to adjudicate those disputes. So monopoly on the use of force for military, only for defense, against invasion, and for police force, and then a judicial system. And that's it. That's pretty much the only function of government. Now, to be fair, everyone's different. Different libertarians will add certain things in and restrict certain things. So I'm not saying all libertarians see it that way, but that is definitely a core central view of many libertarians, that it should serve those basic purposes. So moving on to kind of just briefly looking at the beginning of the trend of libertarianism in our own country, a lot of people go back and they look at philosopher John Locke. And I mentioned John Locke in the when we talked about philosophy of science in the readings, and Locke had his hands in a lot of different things, but he wrote a lot about politics, and he was actually very influential on our founding fathers in the creation of some of their founding documents. And I have a specific example here. The famous phrase that everyone knows, "Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness," comes from the Declaration of Independence. It was actually first written by John Locke in a letter to Thomas Jefferson, and Jefferson later modified what Locke said into the Declaration of Independence. So when Locke said it, he said, "Civil interests," he means rights, same idea. "Civil interests I call life, liberty, health, and the possession of outward things, such as money, lands, houses, furniture, and the like." And in the context of the letter, he's basically saying these are the things that people have a right to, right? These things. And what's interesting is he said property, right? He said we have a right to property. But Jefferson presumably thought that was a little too direct and made it more general and said, no, you have a right to happiness. But either way, the central point behind life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that is negative liberty, right? That's the idea, is that's what the American dream means. You come here to pursue your happiness, to not be restricted when you do that, to not be controlled. That's why some people who come from more repressive governments come here, because they see our government as being less restrictive in that way. By the way, just to briefly go back to negative and positive liberty, you'll notice that in our own system, we have a mix of the two, right? And there's some people who say, look, it's not one or the other. They're both important. It's important to provide people with things, and it's important to not mess with people too, to not restrict their freedom. So for instance, we already have socialist programs, like the police force in our country. It's socialized. You don't have to pay when the police come to deal with a call. Fire is part of our tax dollars. Where we disagree on, what we've had disagreements over culturally, is something like Obamacare, where some people say it shouldn't exist and other people say it should. That would, of course, be a positive liberty. But rights like the First Amendment, or the Second Amendment even, those are based on negative liberty. The right to free speech, to be able to say what you want as long as you're not harming someone else and having the government not tell you to stop saying that. That's a right to negative liberty, right? To kind of do your own thing without interference. Same with the right to bear arms, right? I can have a gun, I can own a gun without someone telling me what to do with my property, especially the government. So we have a mix of negative and positive rights, even if liberals tend to lean a little bit more towards positive and conservatives a little more towards negative. But the people we're looking at are more on the extremes, right? Marx was clearly on the side of mainly positive rights, whereas Rand is clearly on the side of negative rights. So anyways, Locke tells us about, Locke kind of reminds us of that core of negative liberty. And this leads us to libertarianism proper. So like I said, it's mainly based on negative liberty. And I already kind of mentioned the three central functions that a libertarian government would serve: police, military, and justice. Now let's look at some of the other discussions, some of the other arguments libertarians make. So recall Marx's theory of private property. Marx says private property is a terrible, terrible thing. It ruins everything, and it's in fact been the downfall and led to the struggle of different classes throughout history. Ever since primitive communism, private property has ruined everything, in Marx's view. Libertarians and people like Ayn Rand see it very differently. And you'll also notice that, as I mentioned before, there's another philosopher, Robert Nozick, who was a libertarian and actually wrote a book that I cite in the Reader called Anarchy, State, and Utopia, that I highly recommend. Nozick also wrote about private property, and he and Rand agreed that private property for them is a good thing, right? So again, the polar differences in how we define good here, right? How do we define? Marx says private property is an evil. Nozick and Rand say no, it's a good thing. And their argument, Nozick and Rand's argument, is that it keeps individuals in charge so that there is less government regulation, so that they can make the decisions they see fit for their life and their business. So for example, there are people out there who maybe when they were young they had a criminal conviction, or they got caught with marijuana or something, a small amount, and they if they were in the wrong state, they served time, and maybe they're over that, right? They've moved on with their life from that. But every time they fill out an application, they're going to have a background check, and that's going to be found out. Or they have to check the box that says, was in jail before, or whatever it is. A libertarian would argue that a person like that is more likely to have a second chance in a libertarian society, because most places won't hire him if you have all these regulations. But if you have a private owner of a company who says, hey, look, man, you're a good worker. I understand you had a bad, early 20s, you went through some trouble, you got in trouble with the law. You've shown me that you're good now. I'm going to give you a chance. I'm going to let you work in my company. Right? And if you live in a libertarian society that has private property like that is not interfered with by the government, you don't have to fill out any forms. He doesn't have to fill out an application. It can just be sort of a man-on-man agreement between the owner and the person working, right? Or man-on-woman, or woman-on-man, whatever. In that case, it would be a good thing, right? So if there's more power to individuals, it means they can make their own executive decisions that might actually help people who need it. And it also encourages experimentation. It leads to, rather than thinking, well, I have to fill out all the right forms in order to create my new invention, right? If you have less government interference, people aren't as restricted by all those regulations, and they just try new things. They try out different ways of doing things and maybe come up with better ideas, new technologies, and things like that. Now, libertarians aren't denying that there's still experimentation in another society. They're just saying there's more freedom to experiment if you have less regulation, if you have less control of people's behavior. Now, the other side of that, the critique that people sometimes make, is that although it's true that, the example I gave of somebody who maybe had a colored past and bettered themselves, although it's true that helps that person, it also, if you have less government regulation, it could also lead to a Nazi or a racist creating a business where he says, oh, unless you're, if you're Jewish, you can't come in here. And as a libertarian, you have to say, well, we don't want to restrict his freedom, right? So I just want to point out that tension there. Some people say, well, that's why we need some government regulation, because otherwise, it's going to lead to those problems. Now, the other question that arises here is, how does property get in possession of it? How do people become in possession of something then to begin with? Because Marx says nobody should own anything. The private property should be taken away. But if libertarians are saying that private property is important and matters and we need it and it's actually a good thing, we have to know, well, then how does somebody come to own something? How does somebody come to acquire something? If it's not going to be the government redistributing everything, how then does ownership occur? When does private property change hands, and so forth? And John Locke and Robert Nozick, and Locke built off Nozick's theory, they both sort of have ideas here of how this can happen. So Locke's theory of acquisition, right, theory of how we get stuff, how we acquire things, is one that he says is not through the government, but based on your own individual actions. So the way he puts it is, when you mix your labor with something, it establishes that you own that thing, that it is now your property. So what's mixing your labor? You know, like if you invent something new, or if you build a house, if you paint a picture, if you worked on something together with someone else, you both have ownership over it, right? It's like putting something into a project that now means that you have part of that thing. Right? And it could also be like if you're the first one to find land, right? If we go back to settling days, if you're the first one to find a place and you build a fence around it, that's now yours. So the problem, though, is sometimes some people argue, and Locke fully was aware of this, well, if we just base the theory of acquisition on that, then who's to say that someone's not just going to buy up and go take everything and own everything, and they'll have all the private property? And what Locke said is, he said, no, but we have a stipulation in the theory that says you have to, quote, leave enough in common for others. In other words, you're more than welcome, and it's your right to take what you need, to mix your labor with whatever you need, and even to thrive, even to have extra. But if you're taking so much that people nearby or in the community can't have anything, then you haven't left enough in common for others. So in other words, you got to be respectful that there might be other people who need things too. So Locke is reminding us that the responsibility for being respectful to others and making sure they have enough does not lie with the government. The responsibility lies with the individual. Right? So again, I want to keep highlighting that different point, is that libertarians and Marxists and communists are after the same thing. They just think it comes in a different way, right? The Marxist thinks that the government has to provide those things, whereas the libertarian says the individual is the one where the compassion comes from. We don't need to impose compassion on the system, a libertarian would argue. Rather, the compassion comes from the people in individual communities. So that's how Locke saw that theory. And I'll only give you some examples of when you don't leave enough in common for others. Let's just take a simple example from the reader. Is if you are if you're an explorer or something, and you come across a piece of land and you're the first one there, and you build a huge estate there, but then you find out later that there's actually a local community you didn't know about who was using some of that lake. And suddenly now their water supply is cut off. Locke would say, you didn't leave enough in common for others. There were people there who needed that, who were using it, so you're actually required to give up some of that water to them. You still have enough for yourself, you just haven't left enough in common for others that may have needed it. So that's kind of just a basic, more abstract example. But a more concrete example is, I don't know how many of you have ever gone through the process of buying a house, but it's not a fun process, and it involves a lot of red tape and a lot of forms to fill out and things like that. But one of the first things you learn when you start to go onto the housing market, if you're not rich and you're not a real estate developer, is that there's a whole bunch of rich real estate developers who keep buying up the new houses. So there will be, a lot of times, a new house will come to the market, and it's a reasonable price range, and there's many young families who it would be perfect for, who would fit right into the community. They would have a nice house, and they're using the house for their families to better their lives and so forth, to become a member of the community. But they don't have enough money to buy the house outright, so they often have to put a down payment and then make payments over time. That's the typical way it's done. But if you're a real estate developer who has been in this business for 20 years, you're often a millionaire. And you see these houses pop up, and you instantly jump in with cash and you buy the house, and then it shuts it down for any young family or somebody like myself who would want to buy that house, who aren't as well off and don't have as much money. So in other words, Locke would say, these real estate developers are not leaving enough in common for others. They've already made their millions. Right? They already have plenty of money, plenty of houses. And instead of leaving this new house on the market so that an up-and-coming person with a new career can kind of get into the community and make things better, now that real estate developer is buying the house, fixing it up, and then selling it for $300,000-$400,000 more a year later, right? And then that puts it up in a higher bracket. So now that house is now out of reach for people like myself and people who are in a lower income bracket. So anyways, that's another example where Locke would step in and say, hey, you're not leaving enough for everyone here. You already made your millions. So libertarians aren't, in favor of just people dominating everyone else. They're in favor of you taking what you want and even thriving and getting more than you need, but not so much that you're not allowing other people to have what they need too. Now, Nozick adds to this theory, and I'll just turn to the page in the book real quick. And again, I'm not going to give the page number because it'll probably change with editions, but it's in the section on libertarianism, and it's at the bottom of the page, and it's numbered. And this is Nozick's entitlement theory. So, piggybacking off Locke, and Nozick agrees with Locke's points about mixing your labor and leaving enough in common for others. But Nozick says, look, the only way someone has a right to something, to ownership of something, after they acquire it through the theory, the way Locke said, or through these ways. So he says, first, a person is entitled to some good if she acquires it through a natural process, right? That's basically Locke's first principle, that you mix your labor. Secondly, you're entitled to a good if it is transferred to him from another person. So, in other words, inheritance. Libertarians typically don't have a problem with inheritance. They say, hey, look, it's your family, it's your kid, you get to give him money. You get to, that's just the way things are, right? If you're a millionaire, of course you're going to give some money to your kid. You want to help out your family. That's normal. And then Nozick says, no one's entitled to a good except through repeated applications of 1 and 2. So whereas Marx says if you have all that money, that inheritance, that should go back into the public fund and it should be redistributed to everyone, Nozick says, no, that's your money, it's your family, it was given to you as a gift, you get to keep it. So, for instance, a lot has been made of President Trump's $1 million loan from his father that helped him get started. And Nozick would say that no problem. That's perfectly normal. His father wanted to help out his kid. He gave his son a loan. His father was a millionaire. That's the way things should be, right? Nozick wouldn't see an issue there. So anyways, that's kind of, those are some of the central ideas behind libertarianism. Now, Rand definitely was on the libertarian side, but she also had sort of a moral philosophy that guided her beliefs as well. And in order to get there, I need to say a couple things. So first of all, we're going to look at a story called the Ring of Gyges from Plato. But before we get there, I want to say the theory we're about to look at, called ethical egoism, is a moral theory. And I want to emphasize that there are different ways of understanding morality, different frameworks through which we can look at the world. Now, I know some of you will certainly be relativists or subjectivists, meaning that you believe morality is only a matter of opinion. Now, this view, sometimes called cultural relativism or moral relativism, was discussed in the pre-Socratic chapter, so we've already dealt with that. But the one, I'm not going to go into depth on the strengths and the weaknesses of relativism here, but I do want to point out that it is just a theory. So sometimes people say that they believe they've found a fact when they say that morality is relative. It's not a fact, it's just a theory. There's evidence that goes both ways, right? There's actually evidence that there are universal values. There's evidence that cultures, for instance, all value fairness. That's evidence against the idea that values are relative. Now, there is evidence for relativism, like the fact that, as we talked about with the pre-Socratics, that some cultures eat dog and others eat pig, and each culture thinks the other one's weird, right? So there is evidence both ways, but my point is that that's one moral theory. Relativism or subjectivism, that's just a theory. It's not a fact. And what we're looking at now, ethical egoism, is another theory of morality. It's not a fact either. It's another way of understanding what's morally right or wrong. In the final section of the class, we'll look at one more moral theory called utilitarianism, which says that right or wrong is more based on observable consequences like pleasure or pain. And we'll talk about that then too. But I just want to point out that these are all theories. No one has a monopoly on morality. Right? You can't just come in and say, oh, it's all relative. Maybe that there's an argument to be made, but an argument is not a fact. So anyways, I just wanted to give that little disclaimer before we talk about another moral theory. And by the way, if you're interested in moral theories at all, you should definitely take an ethics class, which I teach on campus and many other professors teach too, and some teach it online as well. There's more than 3 moral theories, there's a lot, and they're all very interesting. But anyways, let's get into Rand's particular moral theory. So this starts with Plato's Ring of Gyges, and as you can see on this PowerPoint, this is a free write that I ask my students in my face-to-face classes to do, so maybe pause it and think about this free write for a minute. But I like to call this the Frodo question, because you might remember in Lord of the Rings, Frodo has the ring, and he puts it on and it kind of takes him out of one realm and turns him into another. Now that's not quite what the question I'm asking, but I'm just pointing that out, that it turns him invisible in one realm. So in this story of Plato, a guy finds a ring and he turns it one direction on it. He puts it on and he turns it one direction and it turns him invisible. Not invincible. He can't do anything. He can't go through walls or something or beat people up. But he's invisible. He cannot be seen, although he might be heard. So, you know, for instance, if somebody had the ring, they could be sitting in your room right now. Sorry to freak you out. They could be sitting in your room right now, wherever you are, and you wouldn't know they're there if they were being really quiet. So the question to think about is, if you had a ring like this that turned you invisible, what would you do with that power? Where would you go? What sort of things would you do? So again, I think it's really important to this section to at least pause briefly and reflect on what would you do. It's also kind of fun to think about what you would do in this case. Now, I'm imagining that many of you said things like, for instance, I'll tell you the many answers I've heard here, and some of my own are included. Mess with your friends, right? Some people say, well, I'd make a teddy bear look like it's floating. I'd go into my friend's room and scare him, make him think like there's a ghost. Sometimes people say, well, I'd go into the Vatican. I'd go into the Pentagon and I'd look at the secret papers and the secret meetings they're having and to, see what conspiracies are being hidden from us. Or I'd go to Area 51 and see if there's really some sort of alien experimentation. I'd travel, you go on planes, right? Plane tickets are expensive. I'd jump onto a plane and just chill until I get there. So many things we could do. Here's the real question though, or a important question, is would any of you have destroyed the ring because it was too much power for anyone to have? Would any of you have, done what Frodo does at the end of Lord of the Rings and thrown the ring into the fire, into the lava, so that nobody else can have that power? Most people would say no, although I bet there's some of you who might say, yes, I would do that. Now, in Plato, in the story of Plato's, the Ring of Gyges, the guy finds the ring, realizes his power, and ends up going and seducing the queen of the kingdom he was a part of, and then killing the king and becoming the king himself. And so the story is supposed to show that the only thing keeping us from doing bad stuff is the fact that there are bad consequences for doing it. If we take away those consequences, right, if we take away the limits, the laws, the restrictions, all hell will break loose. So notice that this theory says that the core central point of this theory is that we're all selfish. We are all selfish by nature. And that includes the most seemingly selfless people you could imagine, such as Mother Teresa or the Dalai Lama. According to this theory, to this idea from Plato here, we are all deeply selfish by nature. And the only thing keeping Mother Teresa from doing bad stuff is the law, is the other restrictions, according to this theory. So we're all selfish. And the fact that when you give people this idea that they have this ring and they can do whatever they want, the fact that most people say they'll do selfish things to advance themselves suggests that the theory is true, that we are in fact all selfish. Now, Plato used the theory to lead to something that's now called social contract theory. Because Plato said, well, this is why we need a social central contract in a city or a state, like the Constitution, the Bill of Law, the Bill of Rights, those sorts of things. We need a central contract, Plato said, to keep people in line. Because if they're not bound by that contract, they're just going to go off and do what they want. If they aren't limited in some way, they're going to just go off and do selfish things. So we need a contract to bind people. So that's what Plato said. For Rand, she didn't argue that it was a reason for needing a contract. She just uses the story to illustrate that we're selfish by nature. And so Rand's philosophy builds upon that idea that we are selfish by nature. Now, I do just want to push back a little bit on the idea of selfishness in humans. I would imagine for most people, when they are asked the question, are humans selfish? All you got to do is think about the last time you were on the freeway, right, and someone cut you off, or when you cut someone else off, and you say, yeah, we're selfish. It's a very common response to just immediately say we're selfish. And granted, there's lots of evidence of it, not the least of which is the answers to this Ring of Gyges thing. On the other hand, some people point out that there are at least some people out there who seem to behave selflessly, right? Selfless is the opposite of selfish. It means you're doing it not for yourself. You're performing an action because you care and want to help. And I'm thinking of like people who just rushed into the buildings during the 9/11 attacks to try to save people, or sometimes you see someone fall out of a boat in the rapids or something, and somebody else just jumps in immediately to save them, and what could seemingly be seen as an unselfish action. So, as always, not coming down on either side, I'm just going to point out that some people argue that although we have selfishness in our nature, it's more complex than that, and we're more of a mixed bag, right? We have the capacity to do good and to do evil, some would argue. Either way, for Rand, it's selfishness. And for Rand, that's kind of the core central aspect of human nature, is that we are selfish. So a lot of the rest of her philosophy here that I'll tell you about builds off that idea of selfishness. And the theory that she represents, and she's not the only one, there's been other ethical egoists too, but the theory is called ethical egoism. And you can see from the theory, from the name, that it's going to put the focus on the self, on the ego. And in the same way that kind of Marx inverts Hegel's dialectic, notice that Rand's theory here of egoism inverts morality, right? It turns morality upside down. It's not the way we normally think of what's moral. That's why I said this is another moral theory. We normally think of somebody being a morally good person as somebody who helps others, right? Who puts others first. Rand is saying, no, it's the opposite. You actually have to put yourself first before you can help others. You have to get your own ducks in a row, your own shit together, before you start helping other people. So for her, ethical egoism is a theory that reminds us of our own value, of our own individual ability to achieve our own happiness. And again, this sticks with that theme of individual power throughout Rand's philosophy. And the other kicker is that, notice that language. It says we are morally obligated. In other words, it's actually wrong when you don't help yourself first. Again, inverting morality. I know that seems weird. Let me give you an example. So if you have a person who has not actually worked out the problems in their own life, maybe hasn't meditated on what's right for them, but they just feel guilty all the time when they see the commercials of the Sarah McLachlan commercial with the dog dying, or the dog suffering, or the kids starving in Africa commercials. And they just feel guilt, and they just start throwing money, right? They just start donating and donating and donating. Even though that seems like a good action, Rand would say it's not really done with the right motivation. It's done out of guilt. Right? That's not right. They're not actually behaving in a moral way, even though it seems like on the cover they're behaving that way. Deep down, they're not actually acting rightly, Rand would say, because they're not putting their own interests first, and they should be. Now, Rand argued that we needed to have a government that allows people to pursue their interests. So this goes back to negative liberty, right? For Rand, the main function of government is those three functions I mentioned, but insofar as it allows people to pursue their interests and to pursue their happiness. So a government is one that should allow people to ethically pursue their own ego, to pursue their own wants and desires. Now, there's nothing in principle in Rand's philosophy against helping others. It's just got to come in the right place. So for instance, if I were to make a list of all my rational interests, and by the way, I recommend you do that if you haven't done it before in your life. It's an interesting thing to do, to think about what are the things that are most important to you. You know, on that list, in my case, I would probably have education up high, and family and friends up high, and I would have music and philosophy up high. But after that, I would have altruism, helping other people, donating to charities and things like that. And I do have that in that level. And Rand would say that's good. You've taken care of your stuff that's important to you, and then you helped other people. That was what was kind of your process. That was right for you. What Rand doesn't want is she doesn't want people doing things out of guilt or for the wrong reasons. She wants people to be happy in what they're doing and to donate for the right reasons, or to help people for the right reasons. And she would say, hey, look, if helping people ain't your thing, that doesn't have to be part of your interest, because everyone has a different level of interest for Rand. Now, the reason I have this picture here of, that's a cartoon of former President Reagan, is just to illustrate one more time the tension between Rand and Marx. So Reagan in this cartoon is looking at a farmer, and he's basically saying, and Reagan's dressed all nice and, you know, these upper class clothes, and he's looking at the farmer and he's saying, the secret of prosperity is to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps. And if you notice, and this is the joke in the cartoon, the farmer doesn't even have boots. He's got no bootstraps to pull himself up by, right? So Rand is telling us that we need to have this society that allows people to thrive and follow their own interests. But what if people, and this goes to Marx's point, what if people haven't even reached the level where they can follow their interests? What if they don't have bootstraps to pull themselves up by? Reagan had much more wealth and, you know, came from a much more upper class family, and was able to have more resources to follow his interest, whereas somebody like the farmer in that case does not have that. So this takes us back to economic determinism, is even if one agrees that the government should allow us to pursue our interests, what happens when somebody is literally working 3 jobs to support a family and go to school, and they can barely make classes? Right? There's always going to be that disparity between should we level the playing field to help people have the ability to pursue their interests. Rand would say no, right? Rand would say no, the best people will rise to the top. It's just that simple. Now, I want to distinguish the theory of ethical egoism from another theory called psychological egoism. And it is, I know it gets a little tedious to see all these isms, but it is an important distinction. Ethical egoism, as I said before, is about values or morality, or it's about value theory, not about metaphysics. There's another theory, just psychological egoism, which is basically just observing that we're selfish. It's just saying, well, the theory is that humans are selfish. Notice that's different than saying that because we're selfish, we should follow our interests. Rand is saying that one. Rand is using ethical egoism. She's saying, based on the fact that we are selfish beings, the thing that would make us happiest and that is best for our nature is for us to pursue our own interests. We should not lie to ourselves and pretend that we're selfless or feel guilty when we don't donate. We should be honest that we have desires and we should want to fulfill them. That's ethical egoism, is that we should be pursuing our interests because we're selfish. That's more complicated than just saying we're selfish. Psychological egoism just says we're selfish. Ethical egoism says follow your interests because you're selfish. So it adds an extra level of value to the argument. Whereas psychological egoism is more or less the observation, hey, people cut me off on the freeway, we're selfish. So anyways, make sure you understand that distinction. And then the last thing I want to do in this PowerPoint is to make sure that we're clear on what Rand means by rational self-interest. Because her theory is often straw-manned, right? Straw-man is the fallacy where you misinterpret someone's idea. Her theory is often misinterpreted to mean that people can do whatever the hell they want. Right? When you hear the idea of ethical egoism, you're like, oh, you're saying people should just go off and do whatever makes them happy? Yes and no. Rand isn't saying that people should just do whatever they want. She's saying they should do what they want that is actually good for them. Right? So her theory is actually not a relative theory. She's saying that everybody has an objective sort of criteria that is good and right for them. So for example, let's just take the classic case of a drug addict, a crackhead. If you ask somebody like that who is addicted to a substance, what do you want in the moment? And they haven't, had it in a while, had the drug in a while. They're going to say, I want the crack pipe. Right? I want the drug. That's what I want. But is that really right for them? Is that really good for them? Absolutely not. Right? There's so many ways we can show that, especially if it's a drug like crack, and say you're going to lose your friends, your personality is going to change, you're going to lose your job, you're going to change your brain. Right? There's so many objective factors we can point to as to why the drug is not right for the person, and why the best thing the person should do is to seek help and to stop using the drug in whatever way is right for them. But notice that difference. There's a difference there between just doing whatever you want and doing the thing that is right for you. So Rand is not saying just to do whatever you want. She's saying do the thing that is right for your personality, that would help you achieve your goals. So another example is, Jimi Hendrix, the great guitarist, was known to have started playing guitar when he was like 5 or 6 years old. He would just pick up the guitar, and by the time he was 11 or 12, his parents and people around him were just like, holy shit, this guy is amazing. I don't think it was ever in Jimi Hendrix's rational self-interest to become a philosophy professor, right? That was never on the radar. And it was never on my radar, although I play guitar and I enjoy guitar, it was never on my radar to be the next Jimi Hendrix either. Right? So our rational interests were different. And if I had thought that I could be the next Jimi Hendrix, I probably would have been very disappointed. And maybe Hendrix would have been disappointed if he became a philosophy professor. The point is that we all have different goals that are right for us, and you can be incorrect, according to Rand, about your own rational interests. Another example is that, there might be times, some of you guys might be going through this if you're trying to decide, what am I going to major in college? There are times when you start thinking, well, you know what, I'm going to be, just to take a random example, I'm going to be a psychology major. I kind of like how the mind works, and I've enjoyed the 101 class I took. I think I'm going to major in psychology. This is really cool. But then you start taking more psychology classes, and it's not really connecting as much. And maybe one of your friends even tells you, look, man, you like sociology. In our conversations, you're always focused on, social forces and desires and stuff like that, and different social elements in history, and you don't like psychology, you really like sociology. Right? And then you might think to yourself, hey, you know what? He's got a point. Maybe sociology is kind of what I'm into. So my example there illustrates that you can be mistaken about what's right for you, and part of the process of life and learning to become the person you're going to become is learning how to not do the things that aren't right for you, but to pursue the things that are right for you. And that's what Rand wants. She wants a society where people are doing the things that are right for them, and the government is allowing them to do that without putting too many regulations and too many restrictions on their behavior. So you can be, I know it's weird to say, but according to Rand's theory, you can be wrong about what's right for you. Right? You can be other people can sometimes have a better understanding of the thing that would make you happy, that would make your life be worth pursuing. So anyways, I think that pretty much sums up the core of some of the central ideas behind Ayn Rand's philosophy and libertarianism more broadly.